The haunted cabin in the woods, a true horror. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. The kind of trip you take to escape the hustle and bustle of the city, to relax, and to find some peace in the silence of nature. Mark, a 32-year-old graphic designer, had been working long hours for weeks and needed a break. He had heard from a friend about a cabin deep in the woods, far from civilization. The idea of complete isolation appealed to him, so he decided to take the trip. His friend warned him not to go, though there were rumors about that place. The kind of rumors that made you question your sanity, but Mark dismissed them as nothing more than local superstitions. He didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't believe in anything supernatural. So, on a Friday afternoon, he packed his car, grabbed a few supplies, and drove out to the cabin. It was getting dark when he arrived. The road was long and winding, surrounded by thick trees, with no other houses in sight. The cabin itself was small, old, and looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. There were no lights in the windows, and the place felt deserted. But Mark shrugged it off. After all, that was what he wanted, peace and solitude. As night fell, he settled in. He lit a fire in the small fireplace, grabbed a beer, and sat down with his laptop to catch up on some work. The wind outside howled through the trees, but inside it was warm and cozy. Everything seemed fine. But then it started. At first, it was just the occasional creaking of the wooden beams, the sort of noise you might expect from an old cabin. But soon, those creaks turned into something else. It was like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. Mark's heart raced. He convinced himself it was just the house settling. But then the footsteps came again. Only this time, they were louder, and they were closer. He stood up and grabbed a flashlight, thinking he must have left a window open or something. But when he turned around to check the back door, it was locked. He checked the windows. All closed, yet the footsteps didn't stop. Panicked, he rushed upstairs to check the rooms. Nothing. Completely empty. Mark was starting to feel like he was losing his mind. The air was getting colder. Every step he took, he felt eyes on him, like someone or something was watching him. Just as he was about to go back downstairs, he saw something move in the corner of his eye, a shadow. At first, it was just a blur, but then it stopped moving, standing perfectly still. His heart almost stopped as he saw it. A tall, thin figure standing in the doorway of the bedroom. Its face was pale and hollow, its eyes empty, black pits. It didn't say anything. It just stood there, staring at him. Mark couldn't breathe. His body was frozen in place. The shadow started moving closer, its footsteps echoing in the silence. He turned and ran down the stairs, barely making out the front door before the figure reached him. He ran into the woods, not stopping until he reached his car. Mark didn't go back to the cabin. He couldn't. The terror that gripped him in that moment never left him. He drove straight back to the city and told no one what happened. He couldn't even bring himself to tell his friend who had recommended the place. But there's one thing he knows for sure. He never, ever wants to see that cabin again. Asterisk credit asterisk. Story submitted by USA Mike W. Jack was a young man who always had a passion for exploring new places and seeking unique experiences. One day, he heard from a friend about an abandoned cabin deep in the woods, said to be surrounded by eerie and unsettling occurrences. He was told that the cabin had been vacant for many years and that strange and terrifying things happened there, but Jack didn't believe in such stories. He was determined to see it for himself. Jack decided to ignore his friend's warnings and set out to the cabin, driving for hours through winding, desolate roads. Finally, he arrived at the eerie cabin. The air was dense with silence as he stepped inside. The place looked abandoned, with cracked walls and cobwebs in every corner. At first, it seemed like an ordinary, run-down building just as he expected. Jack dropped his bag near the fireplace and sat on a dusty chair. He wasn't scared. He thought the stories were nothing more than local legends. But just as he was about to settle in and relax, he heard a faint, unnatural sound. At first, it was distant, almost like whispers carried by the wind, but then it got louder. It was unmistakable, a low, moaning noise. Jack tried to brush it off. thinking it was just the wind or perhaps some animals outside. But then the sound came again, this time much closer. His heart began to race, and a sense of unease washed over him. He glanced around the dimly lit cabin, but saw nothing. Suddenly, there was movement in the corner of the room. Jack froze, his eyes scanning the shadows. At first, he thought it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But then he saw it, a shadowy figure, not quite human, creeping slowly toward him. The figure had an eerie, unnatural form, its limbs contorting and moving in impossible ways. It seemed to glide across the floor, without making a sound. Jack's pulse quickened and his skin turned cold. The figure was moving closer, and he could feel its presence like a weight in the air. The darkness seemed to grow deeper, and a chill ran down his spine. In a blind panic, Jack leapt to his feet and ran toward the door. He could hear the figure behind him, its footsteps growing louder as it followed him through the cabin. He reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Desperate, he turned to look behind him, and there it was, standing just a few feet away, its eyes glowing with sinister red hue. Jack screamed, pushing the door with all his strength, and it finally opened. He sprinted outside into the cold night air, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure, however, did not follow. As he ran to his car, he glanced back one last time. The cabin was now silent again, and the figure had vanished. Jack drove away without looking back. He never returned to the cabin. The terrifying memory of that night haunted him forever, and he could never shake the feeling that something was still watching him from the darkness of the woods. Asterisk credit asterisk. Story, USA Jack D. A few years ago, a young hiker named Tom decided to venture out for a solo hiking trip in the vast, remote forests of Oregon. Tom was an experienced hiker, and he had spent weeks preparing for his journey. He researched the area, packed his supplies, and mapped out his route. The trail he chose was a well-known path, so he figured there was no need to worry. But what Tom didn't know was that this particular area of the woods had a dark history, one that most locals were too afraid to talk about. There had been stories about people who wandered too far into the woods, only to never return. Some claimed they encountered a haunted cabin. Others believed it was the spirits of lost hikers that had taken them. But Tom, being the adventurous type, brushed off these rumors as nothing more than folklore. On the third day of his hike, Tom became lost. The forest was dense, and the path was unclear. He wandered deeper into the woods, growing anxious as he realized he had strayed far from the main trail. It started to get dark, and Tom's heart raced. He was tired, hungry, and lost. He knew he needed to find shelter quickly. As he walked further into the woods, he spotted an old, abandoned cabin in the distance. It appeared out of place, its walls overgrown with ivy, and its windows dark and empty. He approached cautiously, hoping to find a place to rest for the night. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the air inside thick with the smell of decay. The inside of the cabin was eerily quiet. It was filled with old furniture, some covered in dust, while others were completely rotten. Tom set down his backpack and started a small fire in the fireplace, trying to keep warm. But as he sat there alone, he felt a strange unease creeping over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Suddenly, he heard footsteps outside the cabin. They were faint at first, but then they grew louder. Tom froze, unsure if it was an animal or something far worse. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. He sat motionless, listening, his heart pounding in his chest. The door slowly creaked open. No one was there, but Tom could feel the temperature drop dramatically. A chill ran down his spine as the whispers began. Faint at first, but then louder, as if someone or something was speaking to him from the darkness. He turned to look around, but there was no one there. The whispers grew more frantic, like a chorus of voices urging him to leave. Panic set in, and Tom grabbed his backpack, ready to run. But just as he turned to leave, the door slammed shut, trapping him inside. The whispers turned to screams, echoing through the cabin. Terrified, Tom tried to break down the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room began to spin, and the walls seemed to close in around him. He felt as if he were being suffocated by something unseen, an overwhelming force that pressed against his chest. In a last-ditch effort, Tom picked up a broken chair leg and smashed a window. He climbed out and bolted into the woods, running blindly through the dark forest, not stopping until he reached the nearest road. The next day, Tom was found by search and rescue teams. He was disoriented, frightened, and barely able to speak. He could hardly remember what happened the night before, only that the whispers and the feeling of being watched never left him. To this day, Tom refuses to talk about the cabin, and he has never returned to the woods. But sometimes late at night, when he's alone, he can still hear the whispers, and he swears he can feel the cold presence of whatever was in that cabin, following him from the darkness. Asterisk credit asterisk. Story USA Tom R. Ryan, an avid camper, had heard about the mysterious cabin located deep in the forest of the Appalachian Mountains. The cabin was said to be haunted by the spirit of its original owner, a recluse who had vanished years ago. Some believed he had been murdered, while others thought he had simply disappeared into the woods, never to be seen again. Ryan, being a curious and adventurous soul, couldn't resist the temptation to explore this legend. He packed his gear and set off for the Appalachian Mountains, determined to find the cabin and unravel the mystery that surrounded it. After days of hiking, Ryan finally arrived at the cabin. The place was just as he had imagined, old, decrepit, and eerily quiet. The cabin stood in isolation, surrounded by towering trees. There were no other signs of life, only the deep silence of the forest. Ryan ventured inside, noticing that the floor creaked under his weight. The place was covered in dust and cobwebs, but it was clear someone or something had been there recently. The strange thing was there were no footprints outside, only those of animals. As night fell, Ryan set up his camp inside the cabin. He tried to shake the feeling of unease creeping over him, but he couldn't. Every creak of the old house made his heart race, and he couldn't help but feel as if someone or something was watching him. The night grew colder, and Ryan curled up in his sleeping bag, tried to ignore the constant feeling of being observed. Just as he was starting to drift off to sleep, he heard it, a soft, slow tapping coming from the far corner of the room. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. The tapping continued, growing louder and more rhythmic. Ryan sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to look toward the corner, but there was nothing there. The tapping stopped for a moment, and then, just as he was about to lie back down, he heard a soft whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. The voice seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Leave now." Ryan's blood ran cold. He grabbed his flashlight and searched the room, but there was no one there. He ran to the door, but as he reached the handle, it wouldn't open. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and Ryan could feel a presence pressing in on him from all sides. In desperation, he picked up an old chair and smashed the window, desperate to escape. The moment he broke the window, the door swung open with a violent force. Ryan didn't hesitate. He bolted into the woods, running blindly through the dark, not stopping until he reached the safety of a nearby campsite. The next morning, Ryan returned to the cabin with a search party, but when they arrived, the cabin was empty. No one could explain the strange events that had taken place, and there was no trace of any recent activity inside. But Ryan knew the truth. Whatever had been in that cabin was still out there, waiting for its next victim. Asterisk credit asterisk. Story USA Ryan J. Edward, a thrill seeker, always loved the idea of exploring spooky, and abandoned places. He had heard stories about a cabin in the woods that was said to be haunted. The locals claimed that strange things had been happening there for decades, and no one dared to spend the night. But Edward wasn't one to believe in such superstitions. He decided that he would venture to this cabin and prove to himself that there was nothing to fear. He packed his bags and set out for the cabin, leaving behind the city's noise and chaos. The journey took longer than expected, and soon he was driving through a remote and darkened forest. After a long drive, Edward finally arrived at the cabin. As he stepped inside, the silence hit him. The cabin was old and dilapidated, with creaking wooden floors and a musty smell. He set up his things and decided to stay for the night. But as the sun began to set, he felt a strange shift in the air. It was as if the forest itself had become deathly still, and the weight of something sinister hung in the atmosphere. Edward shrugged it off, attributing it to his imagination, but then he began to hear noises, scraping sound from the walls and faint whispers. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He grabbed his flashlight and scanned the room, but there was nothing there. The whispers grew louder, and the scraping sounds came from all directions. Edward could feel his heart racing, but he tried to stay calm. Suddenly, the room seemed to grow colder. The flashlight flickered, and when it came back on, he saw it, an unnatural shadow in the corner of the room. Before he could react, the shadow began to move, twisting and writhing like something alive. Edward's blood ran cold. He tried to back away, but his feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. The shadow advanced, and Edward could see its grotesque form, a humanoid figure with hollow eyes and long, bony fingers. Panicked, Edward turned to flee, but the door slammed shut on its own. The shadow was closing in on him, its cold breath just inches from his face. The whispers grew louder, turning into growls. Edward fought with all his might to break free, and finally, the door opened. He didn't think twice. He ran into the woods, not stopping until he reached his car. Edward never went back to the cabin. The memory of the shadow and its cold, lifeless eyes stayed with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something evil had followed him back. And sometimes, late at night, he would hear the whispers again, as though the cabin had come alive in his mind, forever haunting him. ***. Story, USA Edward P.